hand first. And as we do, we're going to welcome our first presenter who came a long way to be with us today, who actually wants to talk about himself. So I'm going to allow the good doctor to do that. Give your attention to Dr. David Ragland.
Hello. I think so, testing. Right.
Is it on? Can you hear me?
No.
Let's figure it.
Magnetism, David, keep disabling the mics.
Yeah, it started off last night.
Impact on mics.
Okay, while that's happening, the table has 4 legs. What's one of the legs?
History.
Right, uncovering history, truth-telling in history. What's another leg?
Yeah,
What?
Connection.
Connections, right. Making connections or building relationships, as we say. The third leg is, somebody said, healing the wounds, okay? And that's on both sides of the race divide. And the fourth leg of the table, because you know we're smart.
Taking
action. The table is built on the table. The fourth leg is what?
Taking action.
Taking action. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be learning about some history. We're going to be building some relationships in the room. We're going to share honest stories to heal our wounds. And then we're going to be willing to take a what?
Action.
Action. Take a stand, taking action. Are we on?
Yep.
Great.
All right, so I'm David Ragland, and I am the Senior Bayer Western Fellow of Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Could you speak up a little bit louder, please?
It's not.
Something's not, it's not you, it's the light.
Alright, so a guy is coming to deal with the mic. Okay. I'm going to try to project until then. How's that? I'm doing this. Okay, I'm getting too many directions.
It's women, what you expect?
Alright. Is that better? So I'm just going to share a little bit about my work and how I approach and think about reparations and what I've been up to. All right. So I want to share 2 definitions with you of reparations. And reparations, and don't worry about taking notes, I'll provide a link to this, so if folks don't have this, they can have it. So reparations by cttt-rva is the repair of cultural, spiritual, psychological, and physical damage done to a subjugated or oppressed people. And COBRA defines reparations as a process of repairing, healing, and restoring people injured because of their group identity in violation with their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. Those groups that have been injured have the right to obtain from government, corporations, institutions, families responsible for those injuries that which they need to repair and heal themselves, in addition to being a demand for justice. It is a principle of international human rights law. And to continue along this line, the United Nations recognizes and defines reparations in 5 dimensions. And the first one is restitution, which is restoring a victim's rights, property, citizenship status, etc. Rehabilitation, that's mental, spiritual, healing, psychological, physical support. Then compensation, cut me the check. 4, satisfaction, and this is acknowledgement of guilt, apologies, burials, rituals, construction of memorials, etc. And then 5 guarantees of non-repeat. And some see that as reformation of laws, but how do we prevent the thing that caused the need for reparations from happening again? And I think in the United States that's very complex, given our connection to, all of our connection to injustice. I was just listening this morning to Michelle Alexander talking about the new Jim Crow 10 years later. And she was describing how most people, like when you go to rural communities throughout this country, and I taught at Bucknell University, and then later I taught at Juniata, and they're surrounded by towns, Huntington and Lewisburg, and the towns are mostly dependent on employment from those prisons that black and brown folks occupy. In addition to the subcontractors who benefit from often people being jailed for very small things, things that people are making money off of, like marijuana. So in this sense, this notion of guarantees of non-repeat, for me, offers something really hopeful. It offers us a chance to completely transform our society. What if we viewed reparations as a political, moral, and spiritual intervention? Right? This intervention that helped us shift how we spent money, helped us shift what was in our retirement accounts, so that we know that we're not complicit in injustice. Helped us think about what does it look like to transfer land back into the indigenous inhabitants. And so we use these definitions of reparations in part to frame our campaign. And our campaign was really looking at what does moral and material repair look like. And this is an image of Callie House that we used for imagery in our campaign. How many people know who Callie House was? Callie House is credited with thinking about reparations in the late 1800s. She was jailed later for creating a pension fund for African Americans. And she was jailed for mail fraud because they said, well, a woman couldn't do this, and definitely a black woman couldn't do this. At one point, people were sending their dollars to Cali for a national pension fund. But we can also think about reparations as dealing with theft of land, genocide and slavery, Jim Crow and Juan Crow, redlining, gentrification, and police violence. And I list these things because we often only think about reparations for slavery. And I think we should be extending it to think about reparations for the world that slavery made, which is our world, the world that we live in. So here's some questions. Who owes reparations and why? Why faith-based institutions? So I think all white people owe reparations. Because if you're white, even if you just got off the boat, you benefit from white supremacy. You benefit from what I talked about last night. The Center for Investigative Journalism has a report that describes how black people are less likely to get a mortgage under the Fair Housing Act. And so if you're black and you have, what they found in this study is that black folks with better credit, more cash on hand, we're still less likely to get a mortgage. than their white counterparts. But also, if you think about policy in police departments, that policy is often based on higher-ups telling police to target a community. So if they're targeting black and brown communities, that means they're not looking at white communities. I shared this last night, but I was in a car once heading to court with my lawyer about some of these infractions, and we were going like 80 miles an hour. And I was like, wait, there's police. And he was like, let's go. So if we look at how police and law enforcement actually like ignore crime from white people, or if we consider that white people aren't necessarily doing any crimes, I think that's part of white privilege and supremacy. But one of the things that I think about in our campaign, we focused on faith-based communities because we thought that the history warrants faith-based communities to think about reparations. And even more so than other communities, given the role of faith-based communities as those who heal and lead us to justice. And so if you look at the history, right, in the early 1900s, the Anglican Church created the Slave Bible. And the Slave Bible was absent of all mentions of freedom, liberation, justice. And it was propagated around the U.S. South, but mostly the Caribbean, in order as a direct response to the Haitian Revolution. But also, if you think about the membership of churches, their membership were often slave holders or people who participated in gross injustice and violence against black and brown folks, against black folks. And then also, we saw in the news that Georgetown University actually benefited from the sale of slaves. So many institutions themselves owned the slaves. But then also, if you think about how people donate and give money, we can consider churches and spiritual institutions essentially slush funds for slaveholders. And also beneficiaries of grants in a racist world. Grants and funding, and the list goes on and on. So we created this campaign, and I'll talk to you more about it, rooted in spirituality and reparations. And this is a little piece from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. Does anybody know who Reverend Angel is? Reverend Angel is one of the only Zen Buddhist priests in the country, and is renowned for her work around racial justice. I'm going to forward it a little bit. Welcome.
Listening.
Oops.
I think that the question of reparations can only be steered forward in conversation. I think one of the steps we've had over the years is to try to situate reparations as a political conversation or an economic conversation, that is only going to be received and understood as a spiritual conversation, a spiritual reckoning. And I think that the human heart yearns for that. I think even the human heart that is intoxicated, as you beautifully said, Dante, on power, yearns for that, because the emptiness of wielding that power is also apparent to anyone that takes a look. And I think one of the mistakes that we can make, and I will caution against it, is to try to look at the people that are on the most extreme ends of things, and that's not who you need to worry about. It's just like politics in America. It's like, what are the independents? What are the people in the middle doing? The people that have some sway potential in them. And rather than looking at their extremes. So I want to say that anything I say is referring not to people that live on the far ends of the extremes, but people that are, I want to say, system makers, structural, the bridge makers, right? They're creating the structures and they're investing in the structures in overt ways, versus what I think of as people, the way that I often talk about how whiteness itself works as a socio-pathological cultural ontology that it induces, it's either seduces, induces, or reduces everyone, but many white people are, for the most part, actually seduced or induced into it. And induced is a particularly important frame, because to be induced is somewhat invisible, and white privilege, white supremacy works most handily when it is invisible. And therefore the surfacing of it and the ways in which, not just that it causes harm, which I think is also a place that we've sat in a long time and have conversations, situating the conversation in the way that it causes harm to the people that are oppressed and marginalized, etc. I think exactly right, Dr. Like it invokes a kind of contempt. It also reinforces the notion of inferiority of those peoples. And so when people are not committed to supremacy, white supremacy as a formal ideological participation, but rather the subtle ways that human beings judge each other all the time, I think that the strategy has to be something that unseats the hidden and implicit bias that allows people to continue to participate in, there's many ways in which progressives point, like, scream and shout at, like, all the horrible ways that people that are marginalized are suffering. And I have to say, I'm like, mostly what that does is tell most of the people, like, yeah, that's right, they're inferior. It wouldn't be like that.
So you can watch this later, but I like Reverend Angel, because we essentially had a lot of conversations as we were forming this campaign, thinking about how reparations fits into a spiritual frame. Given, and she talks about money as a deity, money is God, but also money and resources that are connected to gross injustice and violence. What does that look like to free it, to do what is just and right? And so we created this campaign for truth and reparations because of all of those reasons, and we felt this call of our ancestors in 2019, and still feel that call. So many important moments. In 2019, we saw it was 400 years since Black folks have been on this continent, brought here for slavery. 50 years since the Black Manifesto, where Jim Foreman came to faith communities and demanded reparations. 40 years since the first Truth Commission, or since the Greensboro Massacre that led to the first U.S. Truth Commission. And then 5 years since my ground, all in 2019. And there were many other dates that were really significant. But I personally felt a call of my ancestors to do this work, and many people around me felt the same thing. And so we started thinking about reparations as a spiritual practice. What does that look like? And in that, we created 2 national days of reparations, #Reparation Sunday. And in 2019, they were August the 11th, and December the 22nd. And what we did was, rather than drop this on people like, oh, in your church or in your synagogue or in your temple, we'd like for you to have a National Day of Reparations Sunday. We help them prepare and plan their communities to do this. And so for the first Reparations Sunday, on Juneteenth, we designated Juneteenth as the beginning of a period of preparation and reflection. And we started with a webinar, and we provided online resources for faith communities to begin teaching and learning and having conversations with their communities. And then on August the 11th, communities across the country, I count at least 30 faith communities that I know of, and there were more, who had services on Reparations Sundays. And what we did was, we weren't really interested in collecting money or saying give reparations. We were interested in what does it look like to create a culture of repair. What does that look like? And we thought our faith-based institutions were best at that. But also, what does it look like for faith-based institutions to begin creating reparative relationships? And so for some people, in one faith community, they actually helped to put one of the black organizers in their community, help him finish his PhD. So lots of different things in different communities that people were doing. And the people who were part of this campaign were Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Truth Telling Project for Ferguson, NCOBRA, National Association of Blacks for Reparations, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, Coming to the Table, Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility. And so some of the activities of the campaign included a number of webinars to basically like educate and help people understand the full dimensions and complexity of reparations. So these are just some flyers from that. And then we did a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Black Manifesto. But let me show you a little bit from here first. Let's see. This is from...
Shalom alaikum, everyone. This may be my...
And this is, we did a series of webinars specifically focused on spirituality and reparations. And this is one of the first ones. And this is Reverend Renita, who was a Ferguson activist and is a pastor in the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Move forward if we haven't repented, and we can't repent unless we confess. So what I see is the necessity for white people to understand how historic white stuff has infected the systems and structures that we continue to perpetuate and continue to hold people in bondage today. And and I'm speaking kind of more from a Christian perspective and the community and that I serve, I don't know that we can authentically call ourselves Christians and continue to perpetuate these cycles of oppression. And white people have been so ingrained in racism and the effects of racism that what they see it as normal. And so when there's talk about reparations, the comments tend to be like, well, we didn't do anything, it's our fault, you can't pay back, which totally lets us off the hook for bringing healing to our collective community.
So I'm kind of showing you some stuff so you can know what to look for. All right. Then these other images, we held the Black Manifesto Revival in Atlanta, right around the time of the 50th anniversary. And I don't know if you can see this image. This is one of the representatives from Cobra, and there's a altar, and their ancestors on the altar, James Foreman being one of them. Then we did a convening in Ferguson around the 5th anniversary of Mike Brown's murder, and that led into the first Reparations Sunday. And so this is some of the imagery from the campaign, and this is kind of acknowledging some of the forerunners and thinkers on reparations. And I didn't and this is me speaking at a Reparations Sunday. This is a healing ceremony that we had at the river after the Ferguson convening. And this is a photo from the last Reparations Sunday in my community in New York on December the 22nd. And, you know, I would say like right after the first Reparations Sunday, I ended up giving a week-long retreat at the Omega Institute around decoloniality and decolonization. And we had conversations with Latinx and indigenous communities about reparations. Because every time I was giving a talk about reparations, and particularly white folks would bring this up, well, what about Latinx folks, what about indigenous communities? And I said, well, that's a good question, but we're talking about it among ourselves. And, you know, so one of the things when we had the conversations, we talked about indigenous folks, people that I've been in contact with, Navajo, Zuni, and Navajo Lenape, who live in the community that I live in now. What folks often want is history. They want the history of the land acknowledged. They want access to the land. They want relationships if people, for instance, are giving land reparations. And I'll give you one example. So I think it's apropos that we're here at Union, which is a Presbyterian institution. And the community that I live in is actually part of the Presbyterian Church. And the Presbyterians recently in Stony Point, New York, gave back a piece of land, the Stony Point Presbytery, to the Ragland Lenape as reparations. And I thought that was actually very amazing. But I want to think about that too, because when I was talking to Chief Perry, he said, well, you know, they said they want to give reparations, and what we think about is land sovereignty. So what does it mean when people talk about reparations to different communities? And then he was like, but we were cool. And then, so what they did was they gave the land back, and they created a cultural center, like a nonprofit, to support the maintenance of the land and the buildings on that land. And the Ramapo Lenape created, or their intentions were to use it as a mission to the United Nations for all indigenous people. So they actually expanded the vision of that. But part of what we talked about, and particularly Soul Fire Farm, how many people have heard of Soul Fire Farm? They're in the northeast part of the United States, in upstate New York, and they are involved in the Black Indigenous Reparations Network, where they are supporting the land transfer to Black and Indigenous communities for reparations, and they're also involved in creating relationships that look beneficial among communities. So for instance, traditional types of crops will be grown on land, so on and so forth. So that was essentially my presentation. I'm open for conversation and questions.
The one speaker, the first speaker, when she talked about white privilege works best when it's invisible, I think I was thinking about reparations in terms of a white person, what's the role that we can play? Because it's not just a Black issue, it's a human issue. And I think one of the roles, because that really got me thinking, is that we can do what we can to not make it, to bring it forward, to keep it from staying invisible, and to give power to the voice that this is deserved, and that this is necessary for our country to come together. So how do you see the two, both Black and whites, coming together to work for reparations?
I mean, I see it as, so particularly for Black reparations, I think that it can't be like, say you have a pet project, and you're like, hey, I'm going to give you this money to do this project, right? It has to be, Black folk have to want that. It has to be, I think, Black-led. And at minimum, it has to be like I think we often think about reparations as a big chunk of money, and it is a holistic piece that involves healing, education, restitution and compensation. And it can be what folks agree upon it to be. And one of the roles, I think, of white people is to advocate at all levels of government for reparations. That is not simplistic. And I was telling someone who I met earlier in this room that if the government decided to give reparations tomorrow, I would probably be against it right now, because the U.S. government will probably have a bank that has extractive or racist policies distribute the money. And Whitfield always says that Nike will create a reparations sneaker, and Ford will create a reparations Cadillac. So it would be likely whatever money the U.S. government put forward, a chunk of it will be used to continue our oppression. And without the spiritual and healing dimensions of it, I think people will be like, you got your reparations. and then proceed to call you the N-word. So reparations, I think, has to be intelligent. And it has to like take the full picture of where we are as a country.
I'm gonna try to do this better than I did last night. The city have $1 billion project. And in the $1 billion project, you got affordable housing, you got a Coliseum. How do you put reparation in that so it can help the ones that it displaced when they originally tore the place down?
Did everybody hear his question?
Could you repeat it, please?
So he's talking about the Navy
Hill project.
The Navy Hill project, and particularly like can you say a little bit more?
It was basically a black neighborhood. Black neighborhood was displaced because of interstate. Now, 40, 50 years later, the city wants to redevelop the land. And it's a $1 billion project. They want to do a new Coliseum, 2,000 homes, talking about 200 affordable housing. And right now it's going tick for tack in the public eye and saying that there is no support for the community and they're trying to do gentrification in the community.
And so my basic thoughts are this, and I think this applies to a lot. I'm really interested in gentrification tax, that maybe a community organization can fund and it be a voluntary thing that each person who moves into that new community pay to support, number one, remembrance of what this neighborhood was, but also the actual needs of people being forced out of those communities. That's one thing that doesn't deal with like the actual injustice of what's happening now. But many communities around the country have had reparations policy at the local level. Like for instance, St. Louis, Missouri just 2 summers ago adopted a bill to study. It was very similar to the bill in Congress that John Conyers introduced, a bill to study reparations. And you know, cities like Charlottesville, like their economic development plan was really rooted in addressing some economic inequality, which is why we also saw that march there a few years ago. But you know, I think that cities around the country, whenever there's a new economic development project, they should be considering moral harm that was created in the past, and that, like for instance, you know how if you want to build something, you have to understand environmental impact. What if there's a racial harm rider as well with every single new development?
Whoa.
And this is something that communities can create themselves and tailor for their own communities. But these things are possible. It's happening around the country. People are actually doing things like this. What do you think? And anybody else want to comment on this? Because this is your community.
Where you at? Marty?
Go ahead, sister.
In the fall, I had a shaking experience. I went to the Tidewater to observe the 400 years. And the pre-activity was at my old alma mater. At 12 o'clock, they had a beautiful, it's on YouTube, Voice of America, cable. And they did, many historians were there. And they talked about, or gave a beautiful picture about the problem, and about slavery. and about the misunderstanding. That evening, I went to an area that I remember being at Norfolk State. That was in the area where the Coliseum was. And that was upscale neighborhood. And it was at a white church. A clergy was there. I think it was the urban renewal or redevelopment. And at that meeting, they drew together people from all over the city, clergy. It was equally, it was the first time I've ever seen a gathering of equally concerned white and black people, young and old, agency representative. And they had, and it's on YouTube if you want to go to it. This was gentrification. And I didn't know at the time where Richmond stood on the nation. It's the second in the nation, second of the 10 highest cities in the nation. Gentrification. I didn't really hear, I heard bits of information about the Navy Hill. But it was not, I knew it was a black community, I knew I had a lot of girlfriends, I knew that it would encompass the black community on this side of Broad Street, because whites were on the other side, going to the river. But as I grew up, they were talking about the black community. When I came home, that event was so real and up in my face. And the people that came together was talking about the history of Norfolk and how the privileged whites, the same place that you had the mass shooting, and I knew when I was at Norfolk State, was a place that you didn't really go to. That was before it was developed, Virginia Beach. And the history of how the privileged whites got to Virginia Beach from Norfolk, developing that whole Tidewater Basin, going towards Virginia Beach, Chesapeake and all, was done after the war, where they would take and give persons leaving the war monies to develop outside the city. Now that happened in different areas where they would put blacks in projects. They gave Norfolk State the old golf course. And my point is this: the people that came together in that room with the journal and God, she was on that panel, talked about the atrocities and the way in which they would always promise something and snatch it back. And when I came home and I saw our mayor, I'm calling out because I was born in Richmond, Virginia. 71 on March the 5th. And they were talking about overcoming, and I knew about a community that embraced me and made me feel safe. There were white folk that I asked questions about, and Mama always and Daddy always instilled in me a Christian connectedness. But when you see the politics of this city coming full circle right on around, and you can feel Jim Crow in the streets.
Whoa.
You can feel it when you see the people that are disenfranchised in this city. Sure, there might be a few blacks here. They're on our city council. They're in corporate structures. But the people that were really making a difference for our safety were whites and blacks working together that had a true spiritual base. And last night when you talked about it, you called it out. You called it out. And my thing is, when he was talking and asking that question of how we bring all of this together, because it was up in our face. We got to stop doing what we have been doing and having these kumbaya moments. We have to make it real. We have to be the Christians that we think we are. We have to be that. And my thing is that when he asked that question, I didn't fully, I felt it, but I wanted him to really tell me. And I think we have pieces of the puzzle. That's what we have. We have pieces of it, but we don't know the whole thing. Because when I went to that event, I really didn't know it was at home, up in my face, and it was brewing. And when you had people, the people who wanted to carry to the populace, the government, the heads of the government, black, and people that were setting up the council and everything, and all, they're black. And yet, and still, the concerns for public education are on the back row, excuse me. Public education on the back row. Where are the 50-some black clergy people? It made me sick.
Tell it.
It made me sick. And it still goes in my craw. Because we have, I can think of over Churchill, but I can go all over Richmond, thinking about the people that would turn over in that grave, the preachers, let alone the politicians, let alone Hill, let alone some of the others. They would turn over in that grave if they saw the black people being manipulated, that corporate structure, and filthy money. I'm sorry for getting that.
I'm sorry.
Get it out.
Let me just say something.
It was beautiful last night. It's the reason I pushed myself here, because I should be at home today. But I pushed myself because I said, this is a defining moment, Josie. You need to see what this fellowship is all about. And so when you laid it out last night with As talking about education, by the way, for the black community, education came out of our spiritual understanding. And it came out of our African tradition coming all the way from Africa. They brought their spiritual connection about true religion. And that formulated, and what this is the birthplace. It gave the black church its soul. So my thing is, we got to really, really look at the elephant or the demon in the room. And we really got to face up to that.
Don't be sorry. I truly believe that capitalism is a problem, and it's not good capitalism or reform capitalism. Capitalism is a system of winners and losers, and it is morally acceptable in capitalism for black people to lose. That's the way it's set up. And last night we were talking about this gentrification is not new. We had urban renewal under Truman, cities across the country where black communities were destroyed. There's a good book, Death and Life of American Cities, that Jane Jacobs writes and describes her fight against Robert Moses under that administration, who basically destroyed neighborhoods, and they fought back.
What's the name of the book again? I'm sorry.
Death and Life of Great American Cities. Just look up Jane Jacobs.
James Jacobs?
Jane Jacobs. And they created projects and put black folks in it and destroyed black communities. I lived in Toledo for a while. There's a street called Door Street. It was an entire community, strip of black businesses that was destroyed. And they promised that they were gonna, replace those or better, but they did not. They did the Pruitt-Igo projects in St. Louis, right? All we have to do is just look at our communities. And it's more insidious than we think, because Truman did this initially to pay back some of his political friends. But the last time I was in St. Louis, a friend of mine who's a filmmaker told me that the city council in the 50s had an issue that came to vote, to be voted on. And because the north side of St. Louis, black people were starting to move into the north side. Bigger houses, better schools, right? We know how this goes. And the north side of St. Louis was being so overrun with black people. The city council had a vote to basically cut all funding off to the north side, all infrastructure improvement. They vote, and the plan was to come back later when they had their development plan in place and the financing. And then it was voted down, but in practice, that's what happened. And this is happening all across the community. And gentrification is just recolonization. It is a process of capitalism to make more money off of communities that are already disenfranchised. And there's a close connection between law enforcement, real estate development, and local politicians. To number one, police don't police as much, and crime increases. The prices go down, the real estate value. And I just witnessed this in St. Louis, immediately north of downtown, because they wanted to clear 100 acres immediately north of downtown for the geospatial agency. Now, I knew that neighborhood my entire life, and it was bad, but it wasn't that bad. And when they got done with it, you could buy a house for $1. That's some bullshit.
Ooh.
Regarding the Navy Hill project, I've been at the table on several occasions with a bunch of clergy. And I want to let you know, the lady that just spoke, while there might be 49 clergy that went on record to support, there are more who don't support.
Say it.
And the reason we don't support is because the project has not displayed enough for poor disenfranchised. And they talk medium income and mixed income living. The problem is that when you talk mixed income, that's normally those who can afford it. And for those who can't, what's going to happen? The jobs that are offered, well, 20,000 jobs. These are service jobs. Nobody can feed their family off of a service job. No service job you know of offers benefits. So what's being offered is still not enough to help change the quality of life for many Richmonders. This is the same mayor that I had to go in and fight for in Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority when they were getting ready to clear out 50-some units.
Yeah.
And they were getting ready to throw the people out on the street, and this was at Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And we went in and fought so that they wouldn't do it. The reason they decided not to do it is because they didn't want to shine a bad light as they were moving forward to press forward for the project.
So I'm going to suggest, because you have one of those speakers that's going to be about 15 minutes or so, and the purpose of this is so we can have small incubators to talk about very specific things, and I'm hoping if you can hang around, okay, that maybe that this will be one that you would help to incubate and raise some fresh ideas for what we can do about the neighborhood situation. Shay, is that good?
Can you, I think, can we talk later? Okay. So I think this is a great project for coming to the table to deal with gentrification and Navy Hill. It's a real project that we're experiencing right now. What does that look like? Go ahead.
Can you stand?
Again.
You hear what I'm going to talk about. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. The question is, last night, and I hung around with somebody.
I can't see you.
Last night, you talked about the dimensions of reparation. And I believe it was you or one of the speakers who said, you know, this got to be a spiritual sort of a transformation as we look at reparations. One of the areas we spoke about was the guarantee of non-repeat. Right. Now, this is my question. We have heard about the vestiges of slavery that Black people have been impacted by. I mean, we see it in our health, we see it in our communities, we see it across the board. Dr. Joy Degree wrote a book about post-traumatic stress. I mean, just to tell us this is what's going on with this is why you respond to how you respond to things based on that awful system of slavery that has happened in America. So we know what has been transcended down from that institution. So violent, so cruel. What? And last night, Dr. Brian or you, one of you said that when offenses occur, it doesn't only impact those who've been victimized by it, it impacts the offender.
Yes.
So what was transcended down from the offender who brought this slavery into being? What was transcended down through the generations? Is it brokenness? Is it a lack of conscience? Because that is what's being perpetuated every day, so that these things like Army Hill and all these other
Let me just say one thing about
those type of things exist, because that's why we constantly keep saying, why is this all over these years for generations? What was that thing that was transcended?
the creation of whiteness.
Yes. Sorry.
The creation of whiteness, a profound disconnect between our bodies, this planet, and each other, and spirit.
Can I just make a point of remark?
Go ahead.
That speaks to what you were saying about women. I was born in 1940, and I saw that happen in my hometown of Ragland, Virginia. And it happened to a Black lady that worked in our home from the time I was a tiny child, and I loved her. And that happened. I can see her house today in the Black neighborhood. And when I graduated from college, I was at home eating cornflakes, I'll never forget it. And she knocked on the back door. And what had happened to her in that project is on my heart today. It is the saddest thing to me. That's a white perspective. I just want people to know that white people did care.